Welcome back to Unboxed. Today we're revisiting another mid-range GPU battle, this time between the Radeon RX 570 4GB and GeForce GTX 1060 3GB. It's been a little over a year since we last compared these two in an epic head-to-head battle, so I thought it was about time we took another look. Since the original comparison, we've received multiple driver and game updates, as well as quite a few new games which we've been able to add to our benchmark list. Of the 27 games that we'll be testing in this video, just half a dozen of them were featured in last year's battle. Last time out, the Radeon RX 570 was 2% slower overall, so a very even fight there. Currently, the RX 570 does cost around $10 US more than the 3GB version of the GTX 1060, and for reference, it should cost $170 US, while the GTX 1060 should cost $200 US. Today, though, the 1060 starts at $230 US, while the 570 starts at $240 US. So, like all graphics cards, they were actually better priced a year ago. Representing the green team is the MSI GeForce GTX 1060 3GB X3G, and for the red team, the MSI Radeon RX 570 Gaming X4G. Although both models are pretty heavily overclocked out of the box, we're still going to squeeze every last bit of performance from them with a custom overclock. Stock, the RX 570 Gaming X comes clocked at 1281 MHz for the core and 1750 MHz for the GDDR5 memory. We were only able to increase the core clock to 1435 MHz, a 12% core overclock, and the memory to 1900 MHz, a 9% overclock. And just as a side note, undervolting didn't help us achieve a greater frequency or hold higher boost frequencies. As for the GTX 1060 Gaming X3G, it comes with a base core clock of 1569 MHz, and then the GDDR5 memory is clocked at 2002 MHz. We were able to hit 1770 MHz for the core, and this resulted in a boost frequency of about 2150 MHz, depending on load. The memory also achieved 2275 MHz, so a 13% core overclock and a 14% memory overclock. Now, as mentioned earlier, we have 27 games in total, all of which have been tested at 1080p using both stock and overclock configurations. However, I'm only going to discuss the results for 8 of the games and then jump into our performance breakdown. The rest of the graphs will be available for free on our Patreon page, and the link will be in the video description. I'll probably also add it as a pinned comment. As usual, our Corsair GPU test rig built inside the Crystal Series 570X has been used, and inside we have a Core i7 8700K clocked at 5 GHz with 32GB of DDR4 3200 memory. I realize this hardware configuration is overkill for these GPUs. The idea here, though, is to remove any potential system bottlenecks that might mask GPU performance. Okay, so I think that's about everything. Let's get to the good stuff. First up, we have the Battlefield 1 results, and here the GTX 1060 was 6% faster out of the box and 11% faster once overclocked. So a clear win here for Nvidia, but it has to be said the RX 570 still puts on a show, delivering well over 60 FPS at 1080p using the maximum in-game quality settings. Unfortunately, Nvidia still hasn't addressed their underwhelming Wreckfest performance, and this has allowed AMD to rear-end them in brutal fashion as the RX 570 provides up to 45% more performance. More critically, the RX 570 averaged 60 FPS out of the box, whereas the GTX 1060 3GB struggled to break the 40 FPS barrier. Moving on, we have Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege, and this is another title that really favours the red team. Here the RX 570 beat the GTX 1060 by a 36% margin out of the box, though Nvidia was able to reduce that to a 27% margin in favour of the RX 570 once both GPUs were overclocked. Although Far Cry 5 is an AMD-sponsored title, we saw little to no bias upon release. Both the Radeon and GeForce GPUs performed as expected. Here we see the GTX 1060 3GB is slightly faster than the RX 570 out of the box and 11% faster once overclocked. Fortnite is built upon the Unreal Engine 4 and therefore has a natural tendency to favour hardware from the green team. Here we see the GTX 1060 providing 15% more performance stock and then 17% more once overclocked. Still, it's worth keeping in mind that we are using the maximum in-game quality settings at 1080p and still seeing well over 60 FPS at all times using the RX 570. Total War Saga Thrones of Britannia is a newly released title that plays very well on both AMD and Nvidia hardware. That said, the GTX 1060 3GB has a reasonable performance advantage as it provided 11% more frames out of the box and 16% more once overclocked. Still, it has to be said there was no shortage of frames at 1080p using either GPU. Moving on, we see that AMD's Armour 3 performance has improved out of sight in the past year, and although the RX 570 was slower than the GTX 1063GB, it was only 7% slower out of the box and provided well over 60 FPS at all times. The last game that we're going to look at is Warhammer Vermintide 2, and this is another title that plays nicely with AMD hardware. Here the RX 570 spat out 70 FPS on average out of the box, and that made it 13% faster than the GeForce GTX 1063GB. When it comes to power consumption, the RX 570 does suck down a little more than the GTX 1060. It's at a natural disadvantage here, being that the die is 16% larger, so not that surprising that we see a 19% increase in total system consumption. Still, even when overclocked, we're only seeing system consumption hit around 332 watts, and that includes a Core i7 8700K clocked at 5 GHz. So with a lower end CPU, it's unlikely you're going to see system consumption climb above 300 watts. Okay, so from that small 8-game sample, we did see a bit of back and forth, which is to be expected. Now though, it's time to get the full picture by looking at the results across all 27 games. Okay, so in stock out-of-the-box trim, the GTX 1063GB was on average 4% faster than the RX 570. Not a big margin that, but it has grown by a few percent since we last compared the two, so the 3GB 1060 is still kicking along okay at 1080p. The 1060 enjoyed solid wins in GTA 5, Warhammer 2, Assassin's Creed Origins, and Battlefront 2. It was less impressive when testing with Wreckfest and Rainbow Six Siege. Then, with both graphics cards overclocked, the GTX 1063GB extended its lead out to 8% and was now able to deliver considerably more performance in 6 of the titles tested, providing in excess of 20% more frames. We also see that losses in titles such as Wreckfest and Rainbow Six Siege were also reduced, so if you plan on overclocking your graphics card, the 1060 is very attractive. It also consumes less power, and because of that it does run at lower temperatures, though the temperatures will vary from one model to another, so we haven't focused on that data here. Again, for those of you who are interested in seeing the actual frame rates for those 19 games that we didn't look closely at, please check the link in the video description, which will point you in the direction of our Patreon page, and it is free to access all the graphs there. As for picking one of these GPUs and working out which one's best for you, well, it's probably going to come down to the games you play, as one model might be a little bit better than the other depending on the game. But overall, the experience was very similar in almost every title we tested. That being the case, last time out, I did say there was no right or wrong choice here. It's just too close to call, and that is indeed the case again in 2018. So really, I would go with whichever one is cheapest. That being the case, I do personally gravitate towards the GTX 1063GB at the moment, and that's for a few reasons. And I'll admit, part of me is a little bit annoyed about this because I'm not happy about the naming of the 3GB model. It's not merely a GTX 1060 6GB with half the memory. It's missing an SM unit, which takes the CUDA core count down from 1280 to 1152. This means despite having the same name, it actually features 10% fewer cores. I've expressed my dismay for this quite a few times in the past, so I won't bang on about it here. As frustrating and misleading as it is, it doesn't change the fact that the 3GB 1060 is actually still a really good value product. A fact is, right now it is slightly cheaper than the RX 570 while offering slightly better performance in our tests. So if I had a little over $200 US to spend on a graphics card right now, that is the model I would be getting. As a side note, if you can afford to pony up the extra $50 or so for a fully fledged 6GB model, then by all means do so. But at 1080p, there's no chance you're going to see 20% more performance. So in terms of cost per frame, the 3GB version really does offer much more value. And finally, if you want to take advantage of adaptive sync technology, then the RX 570 makes more sense as FreeSync is more affordable. But as Tim has found in the past, your experience may vary from display to display, so make sure you do your research. And that is going to do it for this one. If you did enjoy the video, well, that's nice. Glad you did, and if you want to show your appreciation, hit the like button. You can also subscribe for more content, and if you appreciate the work we do at Unboxed, then consider supporting us on Patreon. $1 a month will give you access to our monthly live stream, and $3 a month will gain access to our Discord chat. So you get a direct line to Tim, myself, and everyone else in the Discord chat. It's a really cool community there. If you have any problems, you can ask them there, or any suggestions, or anything like that, or you can just badger us all day like some of our Patreon members do, but we love those guys. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time.